So today, while Paul is waiting for Silas and Timothy, we are told that he is distressed by all the idols that he sees. And yet, despite his frustration, he engages in this respectful dialogue with Jewish and Greek philosophers. And during this interfaith dialogue in the synagogue and then in the marketplace, he begins to preach the good news of Jesus Christ. And some Athenians label him a babbler, while others say he seems to be proclaiming foreign gods, which seems kind of harmless until you realize that Socrates was accused of the same thing, brought to trial in the same place, and was killed for this reason. So Paul isn't just engaging in respectful interfaith dialogue, he is risking his very life. And somehow, despite the fact that he's in the midst of people who are suspicious or even hostile to his teachings, he comes out of there alive, with even some saying, you know what, we'll hear from you again about this. How is Paul able to do this? How is he able to have this openness in the court of Athenian public opinion? The key may be the way that Paul begins. He says, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way." Notice he doesn't focus on their idolatry. He focuses on the religious impulse at the heart of all idolatry. Notice then how he connects with them around their shared humanity, their understanding of nature, and that universal longing that we all have for more. And then notice at the end how he presents the foundation of our faith, the resurrection, with clarity and with passion. At a time when Christianity's appeal and influence is waning, I think we can learn a lot from Paul, and I intend to look at what Paul does here under the microscope and consider how we might reach the, quote, well-educated people of our time. Now, let me say at the beginning, this is not an anti-education sermon, although I will be highly critical of our educational system. I'm going to use the word well-educated in parentheses because I wonder how well-educated we really are. And I suspect that much of our education inoculates us from faith. I've been shaped in many ways by Harvard professor Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. He suggests there are 9 different intelligences, and if we are to truly be well-educated, we ought to be intelligent in all 9 of these types of intelligences. The problem is our educational system focuses on the first 5 over and against the last 4. The first 5 are musical, rhythmic, harmonic intelligence, visual, spatial intelligence, linguistic intelligence, mathematical, logical intelligence, and bodily kinesthetic intelligence. You'll notice some schools probably do a little bit more with the arts and physicality, but for the most part, most schools focus on linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence. They don't tend to focus on the other 4, which I think is a major limitation in our education system. So what are those other 4? Interpersonal intelligence. Now, I think we're getting a little bit better at that, but that's the ability to deal with people, to cooperate, to be sensitive to another person's need. Intrapersonal intelligence, which is the ability to be self-reflective, introspective. There's naturalistic intelligence, the ability to read and understand nature, creation. And there's existential intelligence, which is the ability to probe the deeper meanings, the deeper questions of life, to be able to not only explore that, but to better understand what life is ultimately about. Now, it's noteworthy that though Paul was not familiar with Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, he touches on each of these 4 in his sermon to the, quote, well-educated Athenians. A second major limit of our educational model is it trains us to have a dualistic mind, to be either or, black and white thinkers, binary thinkers. So the well-educated among us come to understand things and know things through comparison, through opposition, through differentiation. And so we are taught to use descriptive words like black and white, good and bad, smart and stupid, pretty and ugly, which helps simplify things so that we can have a debate about it, but it oversimplifies things so we lose touch with the deeper meaning that transcends these dualistic categories. Now, this has been a movement forward in evolution for the human mind. It's been a good thing, and I'm not going to talk about all the good things today, but know that there are many good things that have come out of the dualistic mind. But the most essential parts of being human can't fit into those categories, and they don't. Let me give you a simple example. When Nicole and I were preparing for our first child, Esme, we took Lamaze classes and parenting classes. Now, those classes helped us to a point, but the real learning was on the job. It's in the mess, right? And then the second child comes along, Caleb, and you realize the wisdom of John Wilmot's words. Before I got married, I had 6 theories for raising kids, and now I have 6 kids and no theories. The dualistic mind can get us in the door, right? But it's incapable of processing the deeper mysteries of life. The dualistic mind doesn't help us understand grace. It doesn't help us understand suffering. It doesn't help us understand death. It doesn't help us understand love. It doesn't help us understand eternity, and it surely doesn't help us understand the mystery that we call God. To explore these mysteries, we need to evolve to a higher mind, a deeper mind. The mind of Christ, as Paul would say. This is what we ought to be teaching each other. This is what the church ought to teach the nations. These 2 limitations create the third limitation, which helps us understand why well-educated people are often inoculated from faith and struggle to embrace faith. The well-educated, to quote Ken Wilber, often have just enough enlightenment to reject everybody below them as naive, and they can't imagine that anybody's actually smarter than they are. Because our education system doesn't recognize or teach the non-dualistic mind and sees the dualistic mind as the pinnacle of education, the height of education, it tends to create well-educated people who are at once ignorant and arrogant, which are the 2 very things that keep us from mystery and faith. This has led many well-educated people to be taught that atheism is a legitimate intellectual option. But how could you ever reduce the mystery we call God to either-or thinking, black and white thinking? It's like asking the human mind whether it believes in God. It's like asking a fish whether it believes in water. How nonsensical is this? The word God is a word that we use to try to understand or explain the mystery that dwells at the heart of all reality, the heart of all creation, the heart of you, the heart of me. Third, many well-educated people have healthy egos. And of course they do, because they think they're at the pinnacle, right? Everybody worships the well-educated, right? They believe they are a step ahead, but Jesus is really clear that they're actually a step behind. If you believe you're on the mountaintop, you are far away from the posture that you need to be touched by grace. Our ego will never participate in its own demise. Our ego will never accept being demoted. Our ego will never accept the inevitable destruction that comes when grace floods our life. Our ego wants to stay in charge, and that is in direct conflict with healthy religion and healthy faith. Our ego cannot and will not manufacture its own transformation. So let's learn from Paul's approach with the well-educated. He chooses not to beat them up for their idolatry, but to focus on the religious impulse at the heart of their idolatry. And then he focuses on these 3 areas of connection before presenting the resurrection event with clarity and conviction. The first thing he does is he focuses on our shared humanity. Maybe you've heard Teilhard de Chardin's statement, we aren't human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. As people of faith, we ought to teach people to listen to their human experience. We ought to invite people to pay attention to what's going on in their lives, and to invite people to better understand the mystery of who they are beyond the categories that we've been conditioned to see ourselves and beyond the categories we've been conditioned to see others. The truth is, we are all more a mystery to ourselves and to each other than we care to admit, and then the ego wants us to admit. We ought to begin with the assumption that we don't know ourselves that well, and that we don't know each other that well. That should be the starting point. And the truth is, at the heart of you, at the heart of me, at the heart of all of us, is this divine spark that is not touched by sin or illusion, as Thomas Merton teaches. A point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is never at our disposal, but which God disposes our lives from, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own dualistic mind or the brutality of our own ego or will. This is what Jesus is talking about when he says, if you want to find your life, you got to lose it. And if you're willing to lose your life for my sake, you will find it. That's what Paul means when he says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The truth is, the ego is not the center of reality. We are not the center of reality. Christ is the center. God is the center. That divine spark is the center. Merton says, I have no way of teaching people this. I can't make you see this, but it is a gift of grace that is given, and everywhere is an opportunity to enter the gate of heaven. Every moment of our lives, we have an opportunity to see this mystery that is the center of all life. And we'll never prove it satisfactorily to the dualistic mind. We'll never prove it. But we should never shy away from saying it and proclaiming it. Because with help from God, with help from each other, and with help from reality itself, people can be awakened to see. And this is the pearl of great price that can be found by all who genuinely seek it. And it is a pearl of great price and great cost, because when we see it, the cost is this illusion that the ego is the center. Once we see that God is the center, everything else falls into its rightful place, and we realize we're not in charge. The second thing Paul does is he focuses on the natural world. He writes in his letter to the Romans, ever since the creation of the world, God's power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood through the things that God has made. Sadly, religion has not embraced its sibling, science. Sadly, religion has been threatened by science when it ought to recognize that we are looking at reality. We are searching for truth together. And the microscope and the telescope and the non-dualistic mind is searching for the same thing. The mystery that dwells at the heart of reality, the mystery that we call God. Cynthia Bourgeault, who I quoted at yesterday's Leadership Summit, shares a story that gets to the heart of everything I've been trying to say. It comes from Isaac Denison's Out of Africa. And in the story, the main character is captivated by this snake that's moving through the grasses. It has these beautiful colors, and the skin is glistening. And so she is so moved by this that she asks her servant to go and kill the snake so she can put those beautiful colors around her waist and wear them for the rest of her life. But when the servant kills the snake, she discovers, much to her dismay, that these beautiful colors have turned dull and gray. When we look at creation through the dualistic mind, it becomes dull and gray. We turn something beautiful, mysterious, colorful into something dull and gray. But when we look at nature with a non-dualistic mind, we realize that the beauty of the snake does not lie in its skin, but in the quality of its aliveness. The dualistic mind can only break things apart. The non-dual can see the hidden wholeness in all things, to quote Thomas Merton. Healthy religion, healthy faith ought to be pointing people to the mystery at the heart of God's creation, at the heart of all things. Good religion ought to help us to see that the heavens are proclaiming the glory of God, and the firmament, the created world, proclaims God's handiwork. This is not something we will ever prove to the dualistic mind, but we ought never shy away from proclaiming it. And with the help of God, and with the help of others, and with the help of reality, which is our friend, people may come to see what is obvious to some of us, that earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. And those who learn to see take off their shoes, while the rest sit around and pluck blackberries, to quote Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Finally, Paul focuses on the universal search for more. John Calvin, one of our founders, said the human mind is an idol-making factory, but every idol is a failed attempt at finding God. The alcoholic is searching for God at the wrong address. And all of us are searching for God at the wrong address, if we admit it or not. A passionate drunk, as destructive as he or she can be, is already in touch with the deeper longing, and in that sense has a head start on the rest of us. And that longing at the heart of an alcoholic is good. It's sacred. It's holy. It's just needing to be directed to the real thing, the real address, that which truly does satisfy our deeper longing. You see, God is on the inside of our deepest longing, whatever that longing gets attached to. Julian of Norwich says that God creates the void that God alone can fill. So we might ask ourselves, when we're in the presence of an obnoxious, well-educated person, what is it that keeps them to continuing to read and reflect and explore reality? Because that is good. And why is it that those who come to know the most realize how little they know? And how can the voids that we experience in life when we are searching for God at the wrong address, how can those voids open us up to the real thing, to the real one, to the real mystery at the heart of it all? In his poem, Love Dogs, Rumi tells the story of a man who is crying out to God in the presence of a highly dualistic cynic, who questions a man, saying, "Why do you continue to cry out to God if God doesn't answer you?" And this disheartens the man, and he decides to stop crying out for God. Until one night he receives a divine visitor who asks him, "Why did you stop praying?" And he said, "I stopped praying because I never heard anything back." Rumi concludes his poem with these words from the divine visitor, which again will never satisfy the dualistic. Finding is the connection. There are love dogs no one knows the name of. Give your life to be one of them. There are love dogs no one knows the name of. Give your life to be one of them. And all of this sets up the foundational teaching, the resurrection event, which is another mystery we will never be able to prove, but we ought never, ever shy away from and continue to proclaim till our dying day, that the one who was fully human and fully divine, who revealed for us and for all time the divinity that lies at the heart of humanity, the divinity that lies at the heart of all creation, the divinity that lies at the heart of all reality, this one was crucified, dead, and buried, put away forever. And 3 days later, he rose. And he began to appear to his disciples time and time again, story after a story, account after account. And these inept, timid disciples were transformed into this bold, courageous, humble crew that changed the course of human history and transformed this whole thing for all time. And here's the thing. It's continuing with you and with me. And you know what? We are just together a small part of the body of Christ in the world. We're not in control. We're not in charge, but we can participate in it wholeheartedly. And yeah, there will be people who will mock us. And often they will be the well-educated people. But we ought not concern ourselves with that, because it isn't a sign of the limitations of our message. It's just a sign of the limitations of our education system. What we ought to pray for, what we ought to look out for, what we ought to work with are those who say, you know what? We'll hear from you again. Because when that happens, we can know for sure that there is a movement of grace afoot in their life, because none of us can see reality without grace's assistance. None of us can see things as they really are without help from each other, without help from God, without help from reality itself. So we ought to listen for those who say, I want to hear you again. Because we know in that moment, something's happening. Something's happening. And the truth is, anybody who calls themselves an atheist is more religious than they realize. And what seems foreign to them right now will in time hit home, because it is home. It is home. Let us pray. Lord, bring us home again and again to our deepest center, that divine spark, that divine point of pure truth. Help us, Lord, to become more and more available to grace, more willing to be an instrument of grace, and more able to trust that though we may not understand, we live, we move, and we have our being in you. Amen.